is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, yet the next biggest threat is looming ever larger: climate change.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
To save humanity, practically every country has joined the Paris Agreement on climate change, which seeks to keep global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade, or even at 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels.
二氧化碳排放力争于2030年前达到峰值，努力争取2060年前实现碳中和。
By early 2021, countries representing more than 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions and more than 70% of the world economy had made ambitious commitments to carbon neutrality. But the way ahead is not easy. According to the UN's 2020 Production Gap Report, countries must wind down fossil fuel production by 6% per year. However, pre-COVID plans and post-COVID stimulus measures point to a continuation of a growing global fossil fuel production gap. So, with surging investment in clean energy, will nations succeed in their transitions? And what exactly will the world's path to carbon neutrality look like?
Hello and welcome to Dialogue with Thinkers. And this morning, Chinese President Xi Jinping asked the world to step up their actions on climate response and implement the Paris Agreement at the opening of the Boao Forum for Asia. As the world and businesses communities have committed to carbon emission zero, how can international community, governments, businesses, and individuals cooperate on this field? Today, I will be joined by decision makers, business executives, and institution leaders to talk about the path to carbon neutrality. Let's take a look at the panelists.
Ban Ki-moon, chairman of Boao Forum for Asia. He served as the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations from 2007 to 2016. Elizabeth Gaines, CEO of Fortescue Metals Group, one of the world's largest producers of iron ore. She has extensive international experience and a proven track record in financial and operational leadership. Han Jung-ae, Minister of Environment of the Republic of Korea. Leading the country's push to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, she has proposed a new direction for environmental policy since her inauguration this January. Cindy Hook, CEO of Deloitte Asia Pacific. She also serves on the board of directors for the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and contributes to safeguarding the reef from the impacts of environmental change. Jin Li-chun, inaugural president and chair of the board of directors of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. He began his second term as president in January this year and has rich experience across the private and public sectors with multilateral development banks. Young-hoon David Kim, chairman and CEO of the Daesung Group, one of South Korea's oldest energy conglomerates. He is also the honorary chair of the World Energy Council. Janus Pastor, executive director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. He previously served as UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. Zhang Yue, founder, chairman, and CEO of Broad Group, a Chinese private manufacturing enterprise that has been widely recognized for its green policies and commitment to countering environmental problems.
Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Ban Ki-moon to have the opening speech.
大家好. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm truly pleased to be part of the Boao Forum 2021, especially in this year that marks the historic 20th anniversary of its establishment. Born at the beginning of the new millennium, the Boao Forum has been a leading platform for discussion on a wide range of agenda, from trade to poverty eradication to climate change. Every spring in Hainan, intellectuals and industry leaders have gathered and pooled wisdom for the past 20 years, and seeking to promote co-prosperity, innovation, and openness of Asia and beyond. Building on the past achievements, I believe it is high time for all members to join in collective response to climate change and pave the way towards carbon neutrality by 2050, and in case of China by 2060. To pick a word that best encapsulates the year 2020, it would definitely be COVID-19. It is widely known that what underlies COVID-19 is primarily environmental degradation caused by climate change. The climate crisis and pandemics are like just the two sides of the same coin, as they share the underlying causes. The COVID-19 pandemic is nature's warning to humans. We have to listen carefully to Mother Nature's warnings. We cannot negotiate with nature. If we fail to heed the call of the nature, it will be impossible for us to prevent the outbreaks of unprecedented natural disasters and infectious diseases. In April 2018, about 3 years ago, I met His Holiness Pope Francis in Rome, in Vatican. He told me, I quote, "God always forgives. Human beings sometimes forgives, but nature never forgives." How inspiring this message. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, year 2020 can be marked as a starting year when many countries have taken the journey towards carbon neutrality. Backed by the support of around 120 countries, the Climate Ambition Alliance was launched at COP25 in Madrid, Spain in 2019, calling for enhanced action to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Countries have been making pledges one after another, creating a monumental momentum for net to zero economy. In particular, I'm pleased that countries in Asia are taking the lead in this journey. Korea and Japan announced their own 2050 net to zero target. China also made a pledge that it would go carbon neutral by 2060, which is marvelous, given the size of its economy and industrial structure. In this respect, I highly applaud His Excellency President Xi Jinping's admiring leadership for declaring the national target for carbon neutrality in his address to the United Nations General Assembly in September 2020. Indeed, climate action and carbon neutral initiatives are no longer an option, but a must for countries and companies around the world to ensure sustainable living as we enjoy today. With the launch of a new climate regime, the international community has begun a bold journey together to overcome the climate crisis. And this journey is a marathon, not a sprint. Therefore, we should take the wisdom from the famous proverb, African proverb, that goes like this, I quote, "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." That means there should be a global partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, I look forward to this year's Boao Forum serving as a platform for communication that enhances international cooperation and rebuilds robust multilateralism to not only overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, but also respond to the climate crisis. I believe that this is our moral and political responsibility to make sure that our humanity and planet Earth go together in sustainable way. That let us work together to make our world sustainable. Thank you very much. 谢谢.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ban, for your confidence in national governments to committing to climate actions. The Chinese government wished for green development. That involves strengthening green infrastructure, green energy, and green finance. And joining me here is President Jin from AIIB. Of course, it all involves investment. I know that your bank, Mr. Jin, has been very active in launching different products, encouraging climate change mitigation, adaptation. Can you tell us what kind of a challenge will that be? Will every portfolio involve green initiatives?
Thank you very much. I think since climate change is a global challenge, it can only be resolved by global concerted efforts. Nobody could deny that. And as you know, climate change knows no national boundaries. But when it comes to reality, sometimes differences would occur. For instance, who's going to pay more? And who's going to allocate resources for this purpose? And what is the impact on the growth of a particular country, particularly in the low-income countries, if they allocate whatever resources available to dealing with climate change? There's a big concern over the impact on their growth. So we need to deal with all these kind of issues. And when you look at the carbon issue, there are two problems. One is the stock, the other is flow. The stock of carbon accumulation, everybody knows, came from the industrialization of developed countries over the last 200 years. And the flow is no less serious. Because when you look at the starting of the industrialization, what is the population? What is the population today? And in many developing countries over the last 3 or 4 decades, the success in reducing poverty has been translated into increased demand for energy. Nobody has a right to deprive these people of the right to have access to energy. And then direct impact is increased carbon emissions. So people look at this as a kind of trade-off, which means either you emit or you slow down the economy. This trade-off concept, I think, has been deeply embedded in the mindset of a lot of people. That kind of mindset has adversely affected the efforts to promote, or international efforts to promote investment for transition from high carbon to low carbon to zero carbon. So what I mean is we should try to turn this trade-off into mutual enforcement, which means investment in clean energy, investment in the transition from high carbon to zero carbon would promote the growth rather than slow it down. So to move away from the trade-off scenario to the mutual reinforcement scenario is possible. Is possible. If you have this problem, if you don't believe it, there's no way you can mobilize people to allocate resources in the renewable energy and a green economy.
So, Mr. Jin, you're talking about whether there is a market mechanism to ensure that green economy makes economic sense. But do you have any concrete solutions? Because there is always the green premium, the cost that we have to pay for green energy.
It's a very good question, but I think this is an issue between short-term gains or investment or expenditure versus long-term interests. Now, if you take investment in green economy as a kind of expenditure, you would probably be hesitant. But if you think you put resources in the green renewable energy as kind of investment, you have the right to look forward to the future gains.
We have another guest joining me today, Mr. Zhang from Yuanda Group. I'd like to invite him to come over. 金总刚才提了一个
Now, Mr. Jin poses an important question on social enterprise, how they can deal with carbon neutrality transformation. I know that Broad Group pays a lot of attention to green economy and environmental protection. For you, about carbon transformation, what is the challenge and cost for you?
刚刚金行长谈了一个很
Just now, Mr. Jin mentioned a very important question. If we are still investing in traditional coal-fired power generation or other highly polluting systems, those systems will be operating for decades or even over a century. Then in the future, when there are some external factors or policy requirements, those low efficiency and high pollution investments will be a huge burden. As Mr. Jin said, we have to be very cautious in energy system investment. We have to align with the vision adopted by world leaders. My attention is actually on this, where we make a lot of mistakes in our investment. I think it's mostly construction and cities. If you don't turn the buildings into energy-efficient buildings, for example, the walls, if you have insulation, like 20 centimeters, very low cost with ventilation systems for the building, the whole energy consumption may be reduced by more than 80 or even 90% in northern China. So, you don't save energy in different stages or the life cycle of the building. You should do it at the very beginning of construction, so we don't have just a little bit of energy saving at the beginning of construction. It'll be extremely difficult to renovate the building and have energy saving advance. In city development in the past, you have different zones like business zones, residential, industrial, etc. There is a huge amount of commuting that is not very efficient, which also produces pollution. If we have better urban planning, and probably we can do better in this regard, which will be beneficial to both human beings and environmental protection. So, I think urban planning is a critical area. We need strong measures to support carbon peaking and carbon neutrality, because cities exist for over a century or centuries. If you make mistakes, the mistakes will be with mankind for a very long time. In the past, there were so many mistakes in urban planning. People spend too much time in commuting. So you're saying that the governments have to consider green economy standards while doing the urban planning. I think the current process is too slow. And even if we need to go for the highest standard in construction and urban planning at the very beginning with a little extra cost, which will be paid back in a few years' time. If you are not determined in this regard, if you do something in construction and urban planning, we will not be able to reach carbon neutrality targets.
Elizabeth, I know that Fortescue is also interested in a transition towards carbon neutrality company, but what is your challenge?
Look, I think every major business across the world has committed to net zero emissions by 2050, and that does include FMG, where we have an industry-leading target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. So in many respects, that is our challenge. We've set ourselves a very ambitious target. We've just recently updated our target. It was previously 2040, but we feel that there's a real sense of urgency, and we're recognising how important it is to tackle climate change. So we have set ourselves 2030. So that brings with it certain challenges, and we're focused on those very practical initiatives. And for us, that would include decarbonising our entire operations, and we're doing that through large-scale investment in renewable energy, development of a green mobile fleet for mining, for our locomotives and our ships, and for those to operate with green ammonia. And through Fortescue Future Industries, we're harnessing the world's renewable energy resources to produce green electricity, green hydrogen, green ammonia, and other green industrial products. So we've got very ambitious targets, but we have backed that up with practical initiatives. But I do think that one of the important attributes of achieving our targets is we have to have access to capital. We need access to skills, and those need to be skills that are not just available in Australia, but we have to take this at a global approach. We do need government and regulatory support, because to achieve some of our targets for investing in renewable energy, for example, we need to have the right approvals and the right regulations in place so that we can actually make those investments with certainty. And I do think one of the key differences of achieving carbon neutrality is that we have to take an all of industry approach and actually cooperate across industries and across countries. So rather than investing just in renewable energy for our own operations, we could actually approach this as sharing with our competitors, with others in our industry. And I think that is one of the key differences. If we take a strong alignment as an industry to achieving carbon neutrality, then the investments that we're making, we can actually share that technology, those advancements, and to further our goals to achieving carbon neutrality with a genuine sense of urgency and with key measures in place so that we can track our initiatives as we progress towards our targets, which in FMG's case is a very ambitious 2030 target.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Jados, let's talk about the big picture. The Paris Agreement was signed 5 years ago by 196 parties. America walked out and came back in, but what do you think of the delivery of the targets at the Paris Climate Conference, where we are now?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words here, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. First, just a few words about the Paris Agreement. So there are many parts to that agreement, but as far as the emissions are concerned, one can only start judging the real effectiveness once the full set of the so-called national climate plans, the NDCs, will be submitted, and the world gets a sense of the impacts of these national climate plans on the 1.5 to 2 degree temperature goal. And once we have the first stock take in 2023, where the parties to the Paris Agreement will agree on what needs to be done. Now, we're of course not there yet, so it's too early to say. But at the same time, in spite of the increasing number of countries taking on net zero commitments, the signals about the national climate plans are not good. And it is clear that the ambition level for mitigation, including both emission reductions and increasingly also carbon dioxide removal, need to be strengthened. What we've seen is that the current national plans fall far short of the 1.5 to 2 degree goal, reaching more like 3 degrees by the end of the century. And the emission gap continues. 2019, for example, was a record high of 52 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And we need to look at that in the light that by 2030, if we want to reach the 2 degree goal, that needs to be 15 gigatons less. And if we want the 1.5 degree goal, it has to be 32 gigatons less. So that's huge, very substantial. And so the countries must collectively increase their ambitions for emission reductions by 3 times in order to reach the 2 degree goal and 5 times to reach the 1.5 degree goal. So the task ahead is huge. But coming back to the other part of the question, as Chairman Ban Ki-moon mentioned, and it's a pleasure to speak after you, sir, that no country on its own can solve the problem. But even the major emitters on their own cannot solve the climate emergency. Every country is needed. But major emitters can have a role. They can provide, first of all, clear leadership to push or pull the others, the non-major emitters, and to demonstrate that the multilateral approach to addressing the climate emergency can work. They can also provide examples of what they can do to reduce their emissions, to remove carbon, to adapt, and to research the various options. And a good example, of course, is the US rejoining now, and also the China-US cooperation. These are excellent examples.
Okay, talking about the national government's pledges, South Korea joined Japan and China with carbon neutral pledges last year. To learn more about that country's climate commitment, let's listen to South Korea's Minister of Environment, Han Jung-ae, what he has to say.
반기문 국가기후환경회의 위원장님, 진리친 아시아인프라투자은행 총재님, 보아 포럼 20주년을 맞아 영상으로나마 이렇게 만나 뵙게 되어 반갑습니다. 이제 기후위기는 지구촌에서 피할 수 없는 일상이 되고 있습니다. 대한민국도 예외는 아닙니다. 2018년에는 한 달이 넘는 긴 폭염, 2020년에는 54일이나 이어진 최장기간의 장마, 금년 3월에는 관측사상 가장 높은 기온으로 인해 봄꽃이 3주 이상 일찍 피었습니다. 이러한 기후위기에 대응하기 위하여 우리나라를 포함한 EU, 미국 등 많은 국가에서 탄소 중립이라는 새로운 시대를 여는 중입니다. 대한민국은 2020년 10월 대통령께서 2050년까지 탄소 중립을 달성할 것을 선언하였고 12월에는 관계부처 합동으로 2050 탄소 중립 추진 전략을 발표한 바 있습니다. 대한민국은 또한 EU에 이어 두 번째로 전국 단위의 배출권 거래 제도를 운영하며 온실가스를 줄이는 노력을 하고 있으며 2018년도를 정점으로 온실가스 배출량이 줄어드는 긍정적인 성과를 달성하고 있습니다. 그러나 2050년 탄소 중립을 달성하기 위해서는 가야 할 길이 멀고 해야 할 일이 많이 있습니다. 2021년은 우리의 선언이 실질적인 행동으로 이어지기 위한 노력을 기울일 것입니다. 금년 중에 2050 탄소 중립에 따른 온실가스 감축 시나리오를 마련하고 이번 정부 임기 내에 2030 감축 목표를 상향하여 발표할 계획이며 탄소 중립을 달성하기 위한 법령도 마련할 예정입니다. 특히 신재생 에너지 중심의 발전 체계로 전환하고 그린 수소에 대한 투자를 확대해 나가는 한편 해상 풍력도 과감하게 확대할 계획입니다. 지속 가능한 녹색 경제 활동을 촉진하기 위해 녹색 분류 체계를 마련하고 환경 책임 투자를 활성화하여 녹색 금융의 기틀을 확립할 것입니다. 무공해 차로의 전환 그리고 건물의 그린 리모델링을 가속화하는 한편 제품의 생산에서부터 자원화 및 재활용은 물론 농축산 분야의 유기성 폐자원의 바이오가스화에 이르기까지 전 주기를 아우르는 순환경제 모델도 중점적으로 마련 중입니다. 탄소 중립의 여정은 함께해야 비로소 달성할 수 있습니다. 한국은 5월 말 P4G 서울 정상회의를 화상으로 개최하여 세계 각국의 탄소 중립 의지를 한층 더 강화하고 정부, 산업계, 시민사회 그리고 미래 세대를 포함한 모든 주체가 탄소 중립을 향해 함께 손을 잡는 자리로 준비하고 있습니다. 11월 기후변화 협약 당사국 총회의 성공을 위한 중요한 이정표가 될 이 자리에 여러분들의 많은 관심 그리고 참여를 기대합니다. 인류의 미래를 위한 담대한 결정과 우직한 발걸음을 기대합니다. 우리 같이 갑시다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you, Minister Han. Cindy, I want your take on the balance between carbon neutrality, growth, and economic recovery from COVID.
Yes, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here amongst such a distinguished panel. And I think a number of great points have been made on this issue. You know, we've got climate change, major issue facing us globally. At the same time, we're coming out of the biggest crisis of our generation. And I think my observation would be that we need to get the recovery right the first time. I think Yano said it. We need to make sure our recovery dollars go further. And as major investments are being made in economic recovery, we need to make sure that those investments address the climate change challenge. The worst thing that could happen is we come out of COVID, invest in the recovery in a way that leaves us 5 or 10 years down the road facing an even more dire situation from climate and wishing we'd done it very differently. And I think Mr. Zhang highlighted earlier just how long-term the decisions around economic development and community planning and energy are. So, you know, I think what we need to do that is we need good fiscal policies. We need to challenge, you know, governments and business and every decision they're making to challenge themselves. Is the dollar I'm spending got dual purpose, both addressing and helping with decarbonization while also ensuring an you know, a resilient recovery. And I do think there is a chance to build back stronger and more sustainably. In a strange sort of way, I believe that the COVID crisis has given us the ability, as it has in many areas, to accelerate change. So too, I think it could be with climate. And I think there are a number of great examples. I didn't get the translation, but certainly South Korea with their Green New Deal and looking to create 1.9 million new future-ready jobs in the green economy and funding major projects around that is a great example. We're seeing the European Green Deal, which aims at transforming the EU into a much more resource efficient net zero economy, is a pretty great example. So I guess my observation would be, let's not waste the crisis. Let's use this as an opportunity to build back better and more sustainably for a longer and more resilient recovery.
Thank you, Cindy. I want to throw the question of market mechanism to Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim, the world is looking at green deals at different parts. There's the European Green Deal, as Cindy just mentioned. America has its own version. Different countries are imposing different kind of mechanisms. For example, carbon tariffs or carbon market, carbon tax. What do you make of those policies that will have effect on businesses and governments?
I hope that such initiative will succeed in promoting the better environment for these all green initiatives. But frankly speaking, I have a little reservation for such an heavy-handed approach from public sectors. You know, even the largest economy like United States changed their policies so rapidly. And you know, all the political leaders, the lifespan is so short these days. So we cannot rely too much on the public sector's initiative. But what I see is that there is more serious problem for this frustration we face in the process of COP. We all share that kind of pessimism and frustration. I think as a chair of World Energy Council, I found that we published this report as a scenario in 2019 Abu Dhabi Congress, which stated that our dependence on fossil fuels at the moment is about 81% as of 2019, will decrease only by 10% by 2040. So we'll still we will still heavily rely on fossil fuels even in 2040. That's the numbers we found out. And so the fossil fuels will not go away so easily, even with all carbon tax things. I think that's because we have a certain dilemma or trilemma in our endeavor fight against these climate change challenges. We are now, most of our energy storage system is very small scale, good for the cars, for the bed, for laptops, something like that. But if we suppose global or national electrical grid goes beyond 50% renewable, then we definitely need the utility scale energy storage system. But there's nothing like that. And even for the lithium-based energy storage, we are relying on the few regional areas which is actually posing ominous country risks. And I've been with the energy business for all my life. Obsession of the governments, including Korea, was the security of the energy supply. So we are willing to go with fossil fuels, which was very secure, a stable supply. And then now globally, the governments and public sectors are now obsessed with climate change mitigation, ignoring these security issues. But again, these insecurity issues coming back and haunting us in the form of the counter risk for lithium availability. And more than that, now we are drastically cutting off our investment in fossil fuel sectors. And once we realize that once the world economy comes back and we have a tremendous increase in energy demand and find that renewable energy cannot provide, we might have to go back to the fossil fuels. And then there are no ample, sufficient supply of the fossil fuels or stable energy sources. then any price will hike up. And that kind of nightmare can come back anytime. So we have to be more realistic in our global and long-term response to this climate change mitigation.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. A very apt reminder. Reality is always humbling. I want your take on this, Mr. Jin, because China also has made very ambitious targets. In the 14th five-year plan, it plans to reduce the CO2 intensity target by 18%, and we'll get to 25% of our energy on renewable by 2035. But how can we deliver on those targets as we are still very reliant on fossil fuels at the moment?
I certainly cannot speak on behalf of the Chinese government. It's just my...
You have any ideas or suggestions?
But this is my observation.
Yep.
And when the Chinese government intends to do something, they mean it. And the numerous examples can evidence that. But when after President Xi announced this ambitious program, I personally heard lots of skepticism about this, whether China can do it, or is this just a political slogan? But obviously, the Chinese government, to my knowledge, have been working very hard in ramping up their efforts to accelerate the transition from the high carbon to low carbon, zero carbon. My confidence, my optimism is based on the following factors. The Chinese system is very powerful, very effective. If China wants to get something done, you never know whether this is the government's initiative or the people's willingness to cooperate. Let me talk about containing COVID-19. Last year, when COVID-19 erupted in China, and the government imposed very tough, stringent, measures on containing it. But this kind of thing was embraced by the people in China, until you don't know whether this is a government initiative or the people's own initiative. Whereas in Europe, people were taking to the streets, shouting, "We want freedom, we want liberty, we don't want this." That's the different kind of culture. The Chinese would like to put up with the short-term sacrifice, tough situation in return for long-term gains. So this is system, I think, factor. Secondly, technology. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, China has experienced very rapid advancement in technology, new technology. And the private sector is putting a lot of resources in R&D, and so does the government, and we have lots of incubators and research institutes. So now, the whole nation seems to be focused on the breakthrough, technological breakthrough. So this, and third, China has vast amount of resources based on very high saving rates. You must have resources. Where does that kind of resources come from? High saving rate. In spite of the improved living standards, in spite of the changed preference for spending of the young generation, and we still enjoy higher saving rates. That can be allocated for the research and technology development. The fourth, I would say, international cooperation. For instance, the recent dialogue between the representatives of the United States and China in Shanghai, in my view, is the big step forward. Because only by joining hands, when you see these two giant economies joining hands, could it be possible for them to play a bigger role in cooperation in technology and boosting the morale of the rest of the world? Because if the United States is not committed, and people say, hey, we have this big country with technology, they want to be a free rider, so who's going to do that kind of thing, right? So I think this is very much important. And finally, one important point, I'm talking about patent. Let's review the patent. Patent is important to encourage investors to put money in R&D. in return for long-term benefits. That's the upside of patent. But the downside of patent is just because you enjoy the patents, you actually slow down the new development of new technologies. Some companies actually have come up with new technologies, but in order to reap all the benefits of the patent, they put all this on hold without letting them develop. Sometimes they hurt themselves. A typical case is Kodak. Kodak developed digital camera, but because it was worried over the films, it did not develop. Finally, the Japanese comes, took over. But I'm talking about bigger issue, because patent need to protect the interests of the investors. If they put them resources in develop a new kind of technology, next day it's just be taken by everybody else. Nobody's going to do this. How can you solve this problem? My view is the international community need to think about shortening the patent. Let's say 20 years, 10 years, maybe 8 years. So still give them an opportunity to make benefits.
Okay.
Right. Secondly, instead of having the governments pouring resources in R&D, the government would reimburse the private sector. Give them the money only when they develop a new technology. Like the vaccine.
To take ownership of the patents.
Because you see, that's right. You tell the vaccine developers, okay, you do this. When the vaccine is out, it's global pet. Who's going to do it? But you must reimburse the developers for their investment and reasonable level profit. So I think it's important to reconsider the patent system.
Well, very interesting point, because climate actions actually should take place in the common ground between government, businesses, and private citizens. Probably we should reconsider how patents, how economic benefits and social benefits work.
Because you cannot tell people, hey, this is social responsibility. Okay, vaccine and climate change technologies, global public good. Do it. Nobody's going to do it.
All right.
So there must be a new mechanism.
Okay, I want your take on this, Mr. Patsor, because technology is always considered the most important factor driving economic reshaping. What do you make of the current level of technologies that are serving our transition towards green economy? What might come out of the mix?
I think one important area in terms of the technological advancement, as far as I can see, is that there will be an important role for carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions in offsetting the hard-to-reduce emissions, such as in air transport, as well as in various industrial processes such as cement, iron, and steel. And these approaches will be crucial for the absolute removals of carbon from the atmosphere to move the world from net zero to net negative. Now, the distinction between offsetting current emissions and absolute removals of carbon is important. President Jin of IIAB already raised the issue of carbon flows and stocks. Offsetting reduced the additional flow of carbon to the atmosphere, contributing to reach net zero emissions, according to current plans by mid-century. But between now and the mid-century, there will still be a great deal of carbon entering the atmosphere, the stock, and which will need to be removed via net negative approaches. Now, it is essential that increasingly, in addition to and eventually following the offset objectives, nations begin to put in place absolute carbon dioxide removal objectives and implement programs to meet them. Absolute CO2 removal will be necessary to restore the Earth's carbon balance to the extent possible. Now, how much offsetting and absolute carbon removal will need to take place during the remainder of this century will depend on how fast the world is able to reduce emissions to zero. So emission reduction is the immediate priority. But CDR, carbon dioxide removal technology development, takes a long time, especially to reach the scale that we need. So strategies for both offsetting and absolute removals need to start now. And it's very important to have clarity and separate objectives for absolute removal versus offsetting. Now, success in the speed and quantity of emission reduction and carbon dioxide removal achieved will also have an impact on whether or not additional solar radiation modification approaches, such as, for example, stratospheric aerosol injection, might also be needed. Societal conversations to understand the risks and the benefits, and then leading to governance processes to decide whether or not to pursue such options need to start. This challenge was recognized by Chairman Ban Ki-moon in his opening keynote as well. But now, one more word on the technological advancement. There is always need for more technological advancement in the electrification of car transport, the production of low zero carbon electricity. Also, Mr. Kim mentioned a few of those areas. But these actors have actually advanced quite well. Technology development must now focus on the difficult sectors, such as air transport, series of industrial processes such as cement, iron and steel, and so on. And the particular sector where technological development will be needed is for large-scale carbon removal. Much advancement will be needed not only in sort of hardcore technologies like direct air capture and carbon sequestration, but also in areas such as nature-based approaches, advanced biosequestration, such as genetically modified crops, and a range of marine-based techniques. But advancement will also be needed in transsectoral areas, such as technologies that will support consumers to increasingly shift to low, zero, and negative carbon lifestyles, food systems, rural-urban settlement, transport systems, and so on. And most important, and that's my last point on this, technological advancement will not be possible without addressing and resolving a series of governance gaps related to large-scale carbon dioxide removal, such as, and I think Elizabeth Gaines, you mentioned about accounting systems. Very important gaps are there in terms of measurement, reporting, and verification. What is a ton of carbon in this country and another country? Also, governance gaps in relation to linkages between carbon and biodiversity objectives, just to take two examples, but there are many others. And also in terms of international cooperation, funding, and questions of livelihood. So there's a whole range of issues that need to be addressed so that technological advancement will be possible. And maybe that's part of the answer to Mr. Kim's comment about the public sector versus the private sector, is that each have their own roles to play. And the public sector is maybe better at looking at these governance issues to create the right conditions for the private sector to then be able to move forward. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Janos. Well, this panel is also open for discussions with the public. So now is the Q&A session. Anyone has questions, please raise your hand. Gentlemen, please.
Hi, good evening. Thanks, everyone. My name is Martin Ritchie. I'm a reporter at Bloomberg News. I have a question for Elizabeth Gaines of Fortescue. You didn't mention iron ore or steel in your opening introduction, which is the product, iron ore, that you depend on for almost all of your revenues. In China, the steel industry itself says it's responsible for 15% of China's carbon emissions. I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the headwinds in decarbonizing the steel industry and what FMG is doing very specifically to reduce Scope 3 emissions. Thank you.
Well, actually, I think I did reference iron ore, and I talked about the fact that we believe there will be strong demand for iron ore that is produced without emissions, and we're on a target to do that. So our pathway to carbon neutrality means that by the time we achieve that, our actual iron ore will be produced without any emissions. And when it comes to Scope 3, I mentioned shipping. So we're doing a lot of research into the future of shipping and the future of green ammonia as a shipping fuel. And we think that could make a significant contribution to a reduction in Scope 3 emissions, because actually a large proportion of Scope 3 emissions are actually generated from shipping of iron ore, given the large volume of iron ore that is imported into China each year. So we're also working on the future of green steel, and we're working with our customers in China. We know that our Chinese customers, our steel mill customers, are actually also very committed to reducing emissions and to looking at the future of steel making. So we're working with them. We're investing ourselves in a green steel pilot plant here in the Pilbara in Western Australia, and that will give us the opportunity to share those learnings with our customers. So it's a multifaceted approach. We will be producing an iron ore product that is free of emissions. We're looking at the future of shipping, which is a big contributor to Scope 3, as well as the future of steel production. So we're very committed and very focused to achieving that carbon neutrality, not only in our own operations, but by the initiatives that we're taking. We believe that'll contribute to a significantly lower emission steelmaking industry.
All right. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I hope we could have more time, but we're running out of time. Thank you very much, dear panelists, for your insights. The path to carbon neutrality is promising, but it's not easy. That's why we've gathered smart people like you to give opinions so that we may have better choices. Thank you very much. That's it for today's Dialogue with Thinkers. Goodbye.